She came to surprise him with the greatest news of their lives. Instead, she watched another woman walk out of her husband's hotel suite, adjusting his shirt, wearing his smile. Elena Voss didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just looked down at the ultrasound envelope in her trembling hand, the proof that she was carrying his child, and let it fall to the marble floor. She walked away without saying a single word, and the most feared man on the East Coast never even knew she was there. This is the story that nearly destroyed everything and cost one man his soul to get it back. The rain had been threatening Newark all morning, that low gray kind that sits on a city like a held breath. Cassian Moretti stood at the window of his 43rd floor office. He watched it with the flat eyes of a man who hadn't truly slept in 3 days. The city below moved the way it always did. Taxis cutting off buses, pigeons scattering from awnings, ordinary people living ordinary lives. They were completely unaware that the man watching them controlled more of what happened in those streets than any police commissioner or elected official ever would. That was the nature of power when it was real. It didn't announce itself. It simply existed the way gravity existed, invisible and absolute and everywhere at once. He was 41 years old, and there was not a soft edge left on him anywhere. The jaw was hard, the shoulders permanently set like a man bracing for impact. The hands, even at rest on the windowsill, looked like weapons. 3 separate federal investigations had tried to take him down over the past decade. 3 separate times, the cases had dissolved. Not because Cassian Moretti was innocent of everything. He wasn't. He was guilty of enough to fill a courtroom for years. But he was also meticulous, patient, and utterly without mercy when it came to protecting what was his. What was his? He thought about that phrase more than most people would ever know. His organization, his territory, his alliances built on fear and mutual benefit, and the kind of handshakes that left permanent marks. All of it was his, earned through violence and intelligence, and a ruthlessness that had started when he was 19 years old. He had watched his father's funeral from across the street because showing up openly would have gotten him killed by the men who ordered it. But there was one thing Cassian Moretti owned differently than everything else. One thing he had never controlled, never coerced, never taken by force. One thing that had simply, inexplicably, chosen him, Elena. He turned from the window and reached for his phone for the 4th time that hour. Still no answer. She texted him early that morning, something warm and vague. She said she might stop by later if his schedule allowed. He told her it probably wouldn't. He had meetings. He always had meetings. That was the honest and brutal truth of their marriage. He was always in a meeting. The phone on his desk buzzed. His assistant's voice came through clipped and professional. "Mr. Romano is here, along with the Brentwood people. Send them to the conference room. Tell them I need 5 minutes." He put the phone down, pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose, and stood very still for a moment. He had a headache that had been living behind his left eye for going on 2 weeks. He hadn't mentioned it to Elena, because she would have pushed him to see a doctor. He had no patience for doctors, no patience for being told to rest or reduce stress, or any of the other advice that worked perfectly well for people whose stress was about quarterly reports and parking tickets. He picked up his jacket, straightened it, and walked toward the door. He did not know that his life was about to be dismantled. He did not know that in a hotel 3 miles away, a woman was stepping out of an elevator. She was holding an ultrasound envelope with hands that couldn't quite stop shaking. Not from fear, but from the pure overwhelming joy of carrying news so enormous, she felt like she might float right off the ground. He did not know any of it. Elena Voss. Elena Moretti legally, though she kept her name professionally. It was the name on her graduate degree and her published papers, and the consulting work she did for hospital systems on patient advocacy. She had been sitting in the waiting room of her obstetrician's office for 40 minutes when they finally called her back. And in those 40 minutes, she had practiced 15 different versions of how she was going to tell Cassian. She considered a dinner. Candlelight, the good restaurant he liked in the West Village, where the owner always seated them in the back corner and pretended not to know who her husband was. She considered waiting until a weekend when he wasn't drowning in whatever crisis his business manufactured on a rotating basis. She considered writing it down. But when the doctor confirmed what 3 home tests had already told her, when she saw the small gray shape on the screen that was impossibly miraculously real, Elena had made a decision without even consciously making it. She was going to go to him, right now. She was going to walk into whatever meeting he was sitting in, and she was going to tell him. Because some news was too large to wait for the right moment. Some news was the moment. The hotel where Cassian sometimes held afternoon meetings was 10 minutes by cab from the clinic. She had been there before. A discreet upscale place where businessmen with money and reasons to stay off certain radars conducted the kind of conversations that didn't benefit from public settings. She never loved that world, had never pretended to, but she had loved the man who navigated it. She had made her peace over 7 years of marriage with the fact that Cassian Moretti was not a man who would ever be fully extracted from the life he was born into. She loved him anyway. That had never been the question. The elevator doors opened on the 14th floor, and she stepped out, holding the envelope against her chest. And she was already smiling, already running through his face in her imagination, trying to picture the exact second it would register. The exact way those guarded eyes would go soft in that rare private way they only ever did around her. When she heard the suite door at the end of the corridor open, she stopped. Not because of the door, because of what came through it. The woman was tall, expensive looking in the particular way of women who made a profession of appearing effortless. Hair undisturbed, dress unrumpled except for one thin strap that had drifted slightly off a shoulder. She was laughing at something over her own shoulder. A low private laugh that belonged to intimacy in closed rooms. Her fingers were moving along the front of a man's shirt, straightening buttons, smoothing fabric in the absent habitual gesture of a woman who had done this before. Elena saw the shirt first. She recognized it because she had ironed it herself 2 mornings ago. She recognized the cufflinks because she had given them to him for their 5th anniversary. Cassian stepped out of the suite door a half-second behind the woman, his phone already in his hand, his expression doing that shift from private to professional that he was so practiced at. And then his eyes traveled down the hallway and found his wife standing 40 feet away, with an ultrasound envelope pressed to her chest. The world did not slow down for Elena Voss. It didn't do the cinematic thing, where everything goes graceful and quiet. What happened was uglier than that. What happened was that her body understood before her mind caught up, and her stomach dropped the way it does in elevators that fall too fast. The envelope slipped from her fingers without her telling it to. She looked at him. He looked at her. The woman in the expensive dress had already turned toward the elevator and hadn't noticed any of it. She was still smiling at her phone, oblivious. Cassian said her name, Elena. She had turned and was walking before he finished the syllable. Elena, stop. It's not. The elevator opened immediately, as if the building itself was cooperating. She stepped in. The doors closed. She did not look back through the narrowing gap. She was not going to give him the image of her face falling apart. She was not going to give him, or anyone watching that footage, or that memory, or that satisfaction. She stared at the elevator doors and breathed. She breathed very carefully, in and out, in and out. She kept her hand flat against her stomach, her own hand pressing against the secret she was still carrying that he would never now know about. And she made herself breathe until the lobby arrived. And then she walked through it with her chin level, nodding to the doorman, stepping out into the gray Newark morning with its held-breath rain and its ordinary people living ordinary lives. She did not cry until she was in the back of a cab, and even then it was quiet. The kind of crying that doesn't announce itself. The kind that just leaks out around the edges of a person who has decided not to fall apart until they find a place that's safe enough to do it. The driver didn't notice. Nobody ever noticed with Elena. That was one of the things Cassian had once loved most about her. The way she carried herself through difficulty, with the dignity that made other people feel dignified just being near her. He had told her that once, early on, when they were still surprised by each other. You make the room quieter, he had said. Not empty, just quieter. Like things matter more. She laughed at him for being unexpectedly poetic. He kissed her to shut himself up. She pressed her palm flat against her stomach in the back of the cab and thought, I will never tell him. I will never give him this. What Elena did not see, because no one with a breaking heart looks carefully at the corners of hotel hallways, was the small camera above the elevator bank. Where the man standing in a stairwell doorway, 30 feet behind where she had stood, a man with a phone already open to a live feed, watching the scene unfold with the focused satisfaction of a craftsman observing finished work. Silas Romano. He was 45 years old, had been Cassian Moretti's underboss for 11 years, and he had the kind of face that people consistently underestimated. Soft around the jaw, eyes that tended toward warmth when he wanted them to, the relaxed posture of a man who had never once in his adult life been in a hurry. People who underestimated Silas Romano tended to arrive at that mistake only after it was too late to correct it. He watched Elena step into the elevator. He watched Cassian stand frozen in the hallway, the professional mask cracking open in a way that Silas had never once seen in 11 years of watching this man absorb catastrophic news without flinching. Silas closed his phone and allowed himself exactly 3 seconds of satisfaction before his expression returned to its customary neutral. Vivian had done well, better than expected, honestly. The shirt, the cufflinks, the timing, the laugh. It had been choreographed down to the last detail over 6 weeks. But execution and planning were different animals. And Vivian Hale had understood instinctively what the afternoon required. Not drama, not theater, but the small devastating intimacy of something that looked unmistakably real. Not a kiss, not an embrace. A woman's hands on a man's buttons. A private laugh, a too familiar ease. Those were the details that didn't read as performance. Those were the details that lodged in the gut. Silas turned and went down the stairs without making a sound. He had a meeting with Brentwood people himself in 40 minutes, and he intended to arrive looking exactly as he always did. Calm, reliable, and completely, utterly loyal to Cassian Moretti. The hours after were the worst hours Cassian Moretti could remember, and his memory contained hours that would turn most men's hair white. He had gone after Elena. Of course he had. He had taken the stairs 4 at a time when the elevator was too slow, had burst through the lobby doors into the gray morning, scanning the sidewalk in both directions and finding nothing. Nobody, just the city moving past him without caring. He called her phone 7 times in the first 15 minutes. Texted. He had one of his men run the cab company, cross-references to figure out which vehicle had pulled from the hotel entrance at that specific minute. The cab had dropped her at their apartment building. She had been inside for 6 minutes before the doorman watched her come back down with a rolling suitcase and get into another cab. The doorman had not thought to stop her or ask where she was going, because Elena Moretti was not a woman who required management, and he had not known that her husband was going to be calling every contact he had within the hour trying to locate her. By evening, she was gone. Cassian sat in their apartment. His apartment, he supposed, with a bleak accuracy that felt like touching a wound, and looked at the life they had built and the accumulated evidence of it. The books doubled up on shelves because they had run out of room. The coffee mugs in mismatched pairs. The small framed photograph on the entryway table that she had taken herself. The 2 of them on a pier somewhere in Maine 3 summers ago, before everything had gotten so complicated. Both of them squinting into the sun and laughing at something off camera that he could not now remember. He sat, and he did not drink, and he did not call anyone, and he did not allow himself to do anything that felt like grieving, because grieving was for situations that were over, and this was not over. This was a misunderstanding the size of a building that he was going to dismantle piece by piece until she understood what she had and had not seen. His phone buzzed. Silas's name on the screen. Boss, heard things went sideways today, whatever you need. Cassian stared at the message for a long moment. I'm fine, he typed back. Handle the Brentwood debrief. I'll be in tomorrow. He put the phone face down on the table. He looked at the photograph on the entryway table. He said her name once, quietly, to no one in the empty apartment, and then Cassian Moretti, the most feared man on the East Coast, sat down on his own kitchen floor with his back against the cabinets and his hands hanging between his knees. And he stayed there for a long time while the city ran its ordinary operations 12 floors below, completely indifferent to the fact that something had just broken in the man who spent 20 years believing he could control the conditions of his own life. He was still sitting there at 2 in the morning when his phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Silas. It was one of his logistics men. A careful, precise man named Terrio who didn't call after midnight unless the news was the kind that couldn't wait. "We lost the dockside shipment," Terrio said. "All of it. And Marchetti is in the hospital. Someone took him outside his building an hour ago." "It's bad, boss. It's real bad." Cassian closed his eyes. He pressed the phone to his ear and made himself stand up. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said. His voice was level. His face was controlled. He put on his jacket, checked his weapon by habit, and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the knob. In the entryway table's small drawer, underneath a takeout menu and a dead double a battery, and the accumulated small debris of a shared life, was a piece of paper he didn't know existed. The ultrasound printout, which Elena had tucked inside the drawer 3 months ago when she had a preliminary scan, meaning to save it for when the results were confirmed, meaning to show him at the right moment. He didn't open the drawer. He walked out. The door closed. And somewhere 3 states north, in a bus station that smelled of floor cleaner and vending machine coffee, Elena Voss sat in a plastic seat with her suitcase between her feet and one hand pressed flat against a belly that would soon begin to show. And she made herself look forward instead of back. She was done looking back. She had made her decision. The child was hers, and hers alone, and she was going to protect it from a world built on betrayal, starting with the man she had once trusted more than her own heartbeat. What Elena didn't know, what neither of them knew as the distance between them grew with every passing hour, was that somewhere in the city they had both just left, a man with a warm face and patient eyes was sitting in a restaurant booth, reviewing surveillance photographs, and smiling the careful private smile of someone whose plan was proceeding exactly on schedule, and the plan was only beginning. The dockside warehouse smelled the way bad news always smelled, like diesel fuel, river water, and the particular metallic undertone of spilled blood that no amount of industrial cleaning ever completely removes. Cassian arrived 23 minutes after Terrio's call, which was 2 minutes longer than he promised himself, and he stood at the entrance to the gutted loading bay, looking at the aftermath with the controlled stillness of a man cataloging damage before he allows himself to feel it. 3 shipping containers had been burned from the inside. Not blown, burned deliberately, slowly, by people who understood that fire is more insulting than explosions, because it takes its time. Whatever those containers had held was ash and blackened metal now, and the smell of it sat in the back of Cassian's throat like an accusation. Terrio materialized at his shoulder. He was a compact man, ex-military, in the way that never fully leaves a person's posture, and he had the good sense to wait for Cassian to speak first. "How many men?" Cassian asked. 2 down at the perimeter. Marchetti's 3 guys at the entrance, 1 dead, 2 in surgery. Marchetti himself is at St. Michael's. They worked on his hands. Cassian looked at him. His hands, both of them. Methodical. Whoever did this wanted him to be found alive and specific about what had happened to him. Cassian turned back to the burned containers. A message, then. Not a robbery. Robberies didn't leave witnesses with deliberately ruined hands. This was someone drawing a boundary, or testing one, or doing both at the same time with the kind of confidence that meant they weren't afraid of the response. "Where is Silas?" he asked. "On his way. Called me 10 minutes before you arrived." Something small and instinctive moved through Cassian's chest at that. A ghost of a thought that he didn't fully form because he had no evidence for it, and he had spent 20 years training himself not to act on incomplete information. He filed it away to the back of his skull, where he kept things that needed more time, and walked further into the warehouse. The gravel crunched under his shoes. Somewhere a door was open to the river, and the gray pre-dawn wind moved through the space, carrying the smell of the Passaic along with everything else. He crouched down near a scorch mark and looked at the pattern of it, without touching anything. Professional. Whoever set these fires knew exactly what they were doing. He stood back up when he heard Silas's footsteps behind him. That particular loose, jointed walk, unhurried, that was as familiar to Cassian as his own reflection. "Hell of a night," Silas said. "Yeah. You holding up." Cassian looked at him, just looked for a moment in a way that made Terrio take a small step back without consciously deciding to. "Don't," Cassian said. "I'm asking as your friend. I know what you're asking. Don't." He turned back to the containers. "I want to know who had access to the manifest for this shipment. Full list. Everyone from origination point to here. That's a long list. Then start working on it tonight." Silas nodded, slow and agreeable. "Consider it done." He came to stand beside Cassian, both of them looking at the ruins, and he said quietly, as if thinking aloud, "Heard about Elena." The muscles in Cassian's jaw did something complicated. "Not tonight," Cassian said. "I'm just saying, if you need." "Silas." The word was flat and final, the verbal equivalent of a door slamming. "Not tonight." A beat of silence. Silas put his hands in his pockets and looked at the burned containers with the expression of a man accepting a reasonable instruction. "Of course," he said. "Of course, boss." Elena had been on a bus for 4 hours before she slept, and when she slept it was the bad kind, shallow and full of images that weren't quite dreams. More like her own memory running through the same 10 seconds on a loop she couldn't stop. The hotel hallway, the open door, the shirt she had ironed herself, the laugh. She woke up with her cheek against the cold bus window and her hand already on her stomach, which was the thing her body did now without asking permission. Protect. That was the only instruction running in her nervous system anymore. Protect. The bus was passing through some stretch of Pennsylvania highway where the trees pressed close to both sides of the road and the sky was just starting to go pale at the eastern edges. She looked at it without really seeing it, did the math in her head. She had the emergency account, her own, in her own name. She had maintained it since before the marriage because her mother had told her, "Always have a door you can open yourself." She had some clothes. She had her laptop. She had the ultrasound envelope, which she picked up off the marble hotel floor on the way out. Some mechanical protective instinct operating below the level of conscious thought. Because even in the worst moment of her life, she hadn't been able to leave that image of her child on a hotel hallway floor. She pressed her forehead against the window. She thought about calling her sister in Portland and dismissed it. Cassian knew about her sister. He liked her sister. He spent Thanksgiving at her sister's house 2 years running and knew the address by heart. She thought about calling the one colleague she genuinely trusted, a woman named Priya, who ran patient advocacy for a hospital system in Boston, and dismissed that too. She wasn't ready to explain. She wasn't ready for anyone's compassion yet, because compassion would undo her, and she needed to stay intact long enough to figure out where she was going. The bus passed a sign. Allentown, 14 miles. Elena closed her eyes. She did not pray. She did not bargain. She just breathed one breath at a time, the way she taught herself to breathe through the early pregnancy nausea. The way she learned to breathe through 7 years of loving a man who operated in a world that ran on controlled violence and strategic silence. She was very good at breathing through things. What she was not prepared for, but what nobody prepares you for, is the specific grief of loving someone completely while simultaneously knowing you are finished with them. It is not clean. It does not arrive as relief or resolution. It sits in the body like something swallowed wrong. That catches in the chest every time you try to breathe normally. She had been in love with Cassian Moretti since she was 32 years old, and he was the most complicated man she had ever encountered in her life. And she had gone into it with her eyes open, knowing what he was and what his world contained. And she had spent 7 years believing that what they had was the realest thing in either of their lives. That was the part that kept catching. Not the betrayal, exactly. The waste of it. Back in Newark, the next 72 hours moved through Cassian's world like a slow-motion demolition. He slept 3 hours on the couch in his office, showered in the executive bathroom down the hall, and went back to work with the mechanical focus of a man operating on discipline rather than any particular desire to function. Two of his longest-standing business partners pulled out of a pending negotiation without explanation. A contract that had been in final stages dissolved overnight. Someone had gotten to them, had said something, shown something, created some impression that caused men who had trusted Cassian Moretti for years to quietly and suddenly step back. He noticed. He cataloged. He did not yet understand what he was looking at. Elena had retained a lawyer. Not one of his, not anyone connected to his world. A sharp woman from a small firm in Upper Manhattan who specialized in high-asset divorces and had a reputation for being immovable. The lawyer's first call to Cassian's attorney was precise and brief. Elena Voss Moretti was initiating divorce proceedings and requesting that all communication between the parties go through legal counsel. She was not making financial demands. She wanted her personal belongings, her professional accounts, and her name off any jointly held property. She wanted, in short, to disappear cleanly and completely. Cassian received this information on a Tuesday afternoon while sitting across a desk from his own attorney, a man named Garfield. Garfield had been in the family's legal orbit for 15 years and had seen every variety of complicated situation that money and organized crime could generate. Garfield delivered the information the way he delivered most information, with professional neutrality and the faint grimness of someone who is not personally surprised. "She won't take a meeting?" Cassian asked. "She's instructed her attorney that there is nothing to discuss. There's everything to discuss. I'm conveying her position, not endorsing it." Cassian sat back in the chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. He was aware of his own heartbeat in a way that he normally wasn't, because normally his heart did its job quietly, and he ignored it. "Get me a number for the attorney, a direct one. Cassian, not to pressure her, I want to send something. A letter. That goes through proper channels, on record, whatever she needs. I need her to know that what she saw was not what it was." Garfield looked at him over his reading glasses with the measured expression of a man choosing his words. What did she see? Something that was arranged to look like something it wasn't. A pause. Garfield took off his glasses, set them on the desk, and looked at Cassian with something close to candor. "Do you have any evidence of that?" Cassian's jaw tightened. "I'm working on it." "Then I'd suggest working faster," Garfield said, not unkindly, because her attorney filed the initial paperwork this morning. The paperwork arrived at the apartment, his apartment, still smelling of her presence in the way of spaces that a person has recently and permanently vacated, 3 days later. A courier, professional and indifferent, handed him the envelope at the door and was gone before Cassian had finished processing what he was holding. He stood in the entryway and opened it at the small table where the framed photographs still sat. He read through the legal language with the unhurried attention of a man who had been reading contracts designed to obscure their own intentions for 2 decades. The language was standard: asset division, dissolution of marital residence, severance of jointly held financial instruments. At the bottom, in a section he had to read twice, was a paragraph about a bank account he hadn't known existed. A personal account in Elena's name that had been opened 6 years ago and maintained separately from all marital finances. It had been emptied 8 days ago, the day she left. He lowered the papers. She had always had a door she could open herself. He hadn't known that. Hadn't known she thought it necessary to have one. And something about that, the quiet, practical years-long preparation for an exit, hurt in a way that the paperwork itself didn't, because it meant some part of her had always known she might need to leave. Had always held that possibility somewhere in the back of a practical mind, the way sensible people kept emergency supplies in a basement. He put the papers on the table face down. He picked up his phone and called a number he used for situations where official channels were inadequate. "I need a locator," he said when the call connected. "Personal, discreet. The subject is." He stopped, corrected himself with the particular control of a man who is aware of what he's doing, even when it costs him. "The subject is someone important. I need her found so I can make sure she's safe. That's all. Found and confirmed safe. You don't approach. You don't make contact. You call me." He ended the call. He sat down in the kitchen chair that had always been Elena's preferred one. She liked the angle to the window. He put his elbows on the table and pressed his hands against his face. and stayed that way for 60 seconds by the kitchen clock, allowing himself exactly that long to feel the full weight of how badly everything was falling apart. And then he removed his hands and stood up and went back to work. Silas Romano, during this same period, was busy. He was busy in the way of men who are constructing something complex under time pressure, precise, focused, and allergic to improvisation. The warehouse attack had been his work, executed through 3 different intermediary layers that would take Cassian's people months to trace back through, if they ever did. The withdrawal of the business partners had been easier. Those men were always watching for reasons to step back from associations with the Moretti name, and providing them with a credible-seeming reason had required only a few well-placed conversations, and 2 doctored financial documents that suggested Cassian's organization was in internal financial distress. He sat in the private back office of a restaurant he owned under a different name and looked across the table at Vivian Hale. She was eating a salad with the focused appreciation of a woman who has recently completed a difficult job and is enjoying the relief of it. "She's gone," he asked. "3 days ago. My contact at the law firm confirmed the filing." Vivian set her fork down and looked at him. She didn't fight, she didn't investigate, she just left. "That's what grief does," Silas said. "It doesn't look for evidence. It runs." Vivian considered this. "You sound almost sympathetic." "I'm accurate. There's a difference." He turned his wine glass by the stem without drinking from it. "Has she made contact with anyone in his circle?" "None that we've detected. She's gone quiet. No calls to any of his associates. No communication with the lawyers beyond the divorce proceedings. She's effectively vanished." Silas nodded, slow and thoughtful. "Good. How long before Cassian unravels enough to be vulnerable?" He looked at her with the gentle patience of a teacher correcting a student who has asked a reasonable question slightly wrong. "He won't unravel. That's not what happens with men like Cassian. What happens is that the pressure accumulates until the structure develops fractures, and then you apply force at the exact fracture point, at the exact right moment." He finally took a sip of his wine. "What we need is for him to be sufficiently distracted, sufficiently undermined within his own organization, and sufficiently isolated that when the final piece moves into place, there's no one positioned to protect him." Vivian was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You've been planning this a long time. 11 years, Silas said simply. "Since the first month I worked for him. Since I understood exactly what he was and what he had and what it would take to." He paused, made a small, precise adjustment in his phrasing to restructure things. Vivian looked at him with an expression that was difficult to read, part admiration, part the wariness of someone who has just remembered they are sitting across from a specific category of dangerous. And the woman, if he finds her. Silas set his glass down. He won't. And if he does, he folded his napkin with the neat, deliberate movements of a man who is very comfortable with what he's about to say. Then we'll address that when it becomes relevant. The fractures in Cassian's organization widened through the following weeks like cracks in a dam that is being tested from all sides simultaneously. A lieutenant named Prescott, whom Cassian had trusted for 8 years, was found to have been skimming from collection operations. Not a new development, Cassian's accountants established, but one going back nearly 14 months, which meant it had started while Silas was theoretically overseeing the financial audit of that exact division. Prescott, when confronted, was defensive and then frightened, and then, under the specific pressure that Cassian's world applied to situations requiring honesty, admitted that he'd been approached by someone through a third party, who told him the Moretti organization was already compromised from the top, and he should start protecting himself. "Who approached you?" Cassian asked. They were in a basement room that Prescott had been in once before, under better circumstances, and he was aware of what the room was for. And his face was doing the involuntary things faces do when adrenaline has been running hard for an extended period. "I don't know his name, swear to God. It was through a lawyer. Some guy I'd never met before. Said he was representing business interests who wanted to offer a parallel arrangement." Described the lawyer. Prescott described him. Short, well-dressed, rimless glasses, spoke the way men speak when they went to schools that cost serious money. Cassian filed it. Prescott, he said, I need you to think very carefully about whether there is anything else. Anything. Any conversation. Any document. Anything that felt wrong at the time. That you have not told me, Prescott thought. The sweat was visible on his face now, catching the overhead light. There was one thing. 2 months back, I was asked to sign off on a transfer of the dockside access roster. Just a routine update, they said. I didn't think anything of it. Who asked you? A pause that lasted 3 seconds too long. It came through Silas's office. His assistant sent it over. I assumed Silas had approved it. The room went very quiet. Cassian held perfectly still. Thank you, Prescott, he said, in a voice that had gone completely flat. That'll be all. He walked out of the basement room and up the stairs and out into the cold Newark air, and he stood on the sidewalk with his hands in his coat pockets and his breathing deliberate and controlled. The dockside access roster. The same roster that had been used to coordinate the shipment that burned. He stood there for 2 minutes running the connections, testing them, looking for the alternative explanations that intellectual honesty demanded he looked for before arriving at a conclusion that once arrived at could not be taken back. The alternative explanations were thin, getting thinner with each pass. Silas Romano, 11 years. Every secret, every vulnerability, every map of every operation, every name of every ally and enemy, and the precise distances between them. 11 years of sitting in the innermost ring, learning the architecture of everything Cassian Moretti had built, being trusted with the kinds of information that you only give to someone you'd stake your life on. He had staked his life on Silas Romano, more than his life. He pulled out his phone, not to call Silas, to call Terrio. I need surveillance on someone, he said. Highest priority. No communication with anyone in the main organization. Report directly to me. He gave Terrio the name. There was a brief charged silence on the other end, the sound of a careful man recalibrating the landscape of everything he thought he knew. Understood, Terrio said quietly, with the specific quietness of a man who has just been handed a weight. Cassian put the phone away. He looked up at the Newark sky, which was the same gray it had been every day since Elena left, as if the city itself had given up on sunlight. And he thought about the fact that the same man who had engineered his wife's disappearance might also be systematically dismantling the organization from within. He thought about the 11 years and the access and the patience required to build a trap this comprehensive. He thought about Elena, somewhere he couldn't find her, carrying a grief she hadn't deserved. And then he thought about the hotel surveillance footage. He'd requested it weeks ago, through official channels, and been told the system had experienced a malfunction that day. A 40-minute gap in recording that covered the exact period when Elena had stepped off the elevator. He'd accepted that at the time. Accepted it the way you accept the small mechanical failures that daily life produces constantly, because his mind had been elsewhere, and there had been a dozen other things demanding his attention. He was not accepting it anymore. He called his tech guy, a quiet, extraordinary person named Jules, who operated out of an office above a printing shop in the Ironbound district, and who had once reconstructed a deleted hard drive for Cassian that had contained enough information to end 3 careers. The Alderton Hotel, Cassian said, 14th floor corridor surveillance, 4 weeks ago, afternoon. I need whatever was on that system before it was wiped. You're saying it was wiped, Jules asked. I'm saying the hotel told me it malfunctioned. I'm asking you to tell me which one it was. A brief silence. That's going to take some time. How much? If the system is what I think it is, and if someone was careful, a week. If they weren't careful, 3 days. Be back to me in 3 days, Cassian said, and ended the call. He stood on the cold Newark sidewalk with the wind coming off the river and the city moving past him in its ordinary, indifferent way, and understood that he was now operating inside a war that had been declared against him, without his knowledge, by someone who had spent over a decade inside his defenses, and that the first casualty of that war had been his marriage. His wife was somewhere he couldn't reach her. His organization was bleeding from wounds that had been inflicted from the inside. And somewhere, the man he trusted most in the world was sitting across a restaurant table talking about restructuring in a tone of voice that would have sounded reasonable to anyone who didn't understand what it meant. Jules called back in 2 days and 14 hours. "You were right," Jules said. "It wasn't a malfunction." Cassian had been awake for 19 hours and was sitting at his office desk with a cold cup of coffee at his elbow and a legal pad in front of him, covered in connections and names and dates, written in his own cramped handwriting. "Send me what you found," he said. "Already sent, Cassian." Jules paused, which he almost never did. "There's a face on the recovered footage in the stairwell doorway, 30 feet behind where your wife was standing." Cassian opened the file on his computer. The image was grainy, recovered and reconstructed from a system that had been professionally scrubbed, and it was not perfect, but it was enough. He recognized the loose, jointed posture before the software finished resolving the face. He recognized the slight tilt of the head, the hands in the pockets. The characteristic ease of a man who was never in a hurry because he always arrived exactly where he'd planned to be. Cassian Moretti sat at his desk and looked at the face of his underboss standing in a stairwell, watching Elena walk to the elevator on the worst day of her life. And he understood, with a totality that settled through him like cold water, exactly what had happened to his marriage, and exactly who had built the knife, and exactly how it had been driven in. His hand, resting on the desk, was entirely still. His face showed nothing. But something behind his eyes went very, very quiet. The specific quiet of a man who has stopped feeling the wound because he has already moved past it into the only territory that matters now. What comes next? He picked up his phone. He did not call Silas. He called the locator he had hired to find Elena. It went to voicemail. He called again. On the fourth call, someone picked up who was not the locator. A man whose voice he didn't recognize, breathing fast, saying in a low and urgent register, "Mr. Moretti, my name doesn't matter. What matters is that your wife has been found, not by your man, by someone else, and they're already moving." The cold that went through Cassian in that moment had nothing to do with temperature. It was the cold of a man who has just understood that the timeline he thought he had, the weeks, the careful evidence gathering, the deliberate and controlled approach, has just collapsed to nothing. "Where is she?" he said. The voice on the phone gave him an address, a coastal town, a small hotel above the water, 300 miles away. Cassian was already standing, already reaching for his jacket, already doing the math on driving time versus flying time versus the risk of either, when the voice said one more thing, said it quietly, and with the particular emphasis of someone delivering information they understand to be catastrophic. "Mr. Moretti, she's very pregnant. You need to move now." The phone dropped away from his ear. He stood in his office with the city spread out below him in all its ordinary indifference, and understood that everything he thought he was fighting for, the organization, the reputation, the careful reconstruction of what had been destroyed, none of it was what he was actually fighting for. He had been fighting for the wrong things. He moved, he drove, not flew, drove, because flying meant airports, and airports meant names on manifests, and names on manifests meant Silas knowing where he was going before he got there. And that was a variable Cassian could no longer afford. He took the black sedan himself, no driver, no escort. Told Terrio only that he was handling something personal and would be unreachable for 6 hours, and pulled out of the Newark parking structure at 11:40 in the evening, with 300 miles of highway between him and a coastal town he'd never been to, and a woman who didn't know he was coming. The interstate at midnight was the kind of empty that makes distances feel abstract. He pushed the car to 90 and held it there, both hands on the wheel, the heater running against the November cold coming through the seals. And he did not play music, and he did not make calls, and he did not allow himself to think about anything except the road and the math and the specific tactical problem of arriving before whoever was already moving arrived first. The voice on the phone had not given him a name, had not told him who had sent the men, or how many, or how close they already were to that address. Had simply delivered the information and gone silent when he tried to ask follow-up questions, the line cutting off with the clean finality of a burner phone being destroyed. Someone had wanted him to know. Someone had weighed the cost of telling him and decided it was worth it, which meant someone in Silas's orbit had a limit he hadn't anticipated, or a loyalty that ran counter to his interests, or simply the particular human discomfort of being complicit in the murder of a pregnant woman that even trained and compromised people sometimes cannot override. Cassian filed that away. It would matter later. For now, there was the highway and the miles in the night. He thought about what the voice had said. Very pregnant. He turned the phrase over in his mind, the way you turn something sharp over to understand all its edges. Elena had left 8 months ago. She had been in the hotel that day. She had come to the hotel, and she had been carrying something in her hand, an envelope. And he had seen it fall when she lowered her arm, and he had not understood what it was because his mind had been consuming itself on the image of Vivian Hale's hand on his shirt buttons and the expression on his wife's face. And he had not. He had not let himself. He pressed his foot harder on the accelerator. The speedometer touched 102. He breathed through his nose and made himself do the arithmetic he'd been refusing to do for 8 months. She'd left in early March. She was visibly pregnant now, per the voice on the phone, per the locator's last report before someone else had picked up his phone. That meant the pregnancy had existed in March. Had existed on the day she came to the hotel. She had come to tell him. She had come with the envelope, which he now understood with a certainty that didn't require confirmation, had been an ultrasound, and she had stepped off that elevator, ready to give him the best news of both their lives. And instead she had watched a staged performance so precisely calibrated that it had looked like exactly what it was designed to look like. And she had turned around and walked away and never told him. He understood why. He understood it completely. And the understanding was its own specific category of damage. The kind that doesn't announce itself as pain, but simply sits in the chest and changes the pressure of everything around it. She hadn't told him because she believed in that moment that the man she was carrying a child for had already chosen someone else. And in the world Elena had grown up in, and the person Elena fundamentally was, you did not hand your child to a man who had already made his choice. You picked up what was left of yourself, and you protected what you still had, and you did not, under any circumstances, let him see you break. Cassian knew his wife. He had loved his wife for 7 years. He knew exactly how she would have breathed in that elevator, exactly how she would have held herself through the lobby. He could reconstruct it down to the angle of her chin. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth for a moment and then put it back on the wheel. 104 miles an hour. The highway stretched ahead of him like a sentence that hadn't ended yet. The coastal town revealed itself around 2 in the morning as a scatter of lights against the dark bulk of the shoreline. The kind of small place that has exactly one main street and knows everyone who drives down it. Cassian slowed to legal speeds as he entered the town limits and followed the address from memory. He'd repeated it to himself 40 times during the drive, a mnemonic habit from his early years when writing things down was dangerous. The hotel was 3 stories. Weathered clapboard, the kind of building that had been standing since before anyone currently alive could remember, and intended to go on standing indefinitely. A lamp burned in the lobby window. The parking lot held 4 cars and a van with a surf shop logo on the side. He parked on the street half a block down and sat for a moment looking at it. The street was quiet. No vehicles that read wrong. No figures in parked cars. No subtle wrongness in the arrangement of shadows. But that was the problem with professionals. They were supposed to look like nothing. He got out of the car. He had a weapon at his back, and another at his ankle, and 40 years of accumulated instinct that had kept him alive through situations considerably more dangerous than a quiet coastal street at 2 in the morning. And he moved down the sidewalk at a pace that was neither hurried nor casual. The pace of a man with a specific destination who sees no reason to draw attention to the fact. The front door of the hotel was unlocked. A small desk in the lobby with nobody behind it, night staff either asleep in the back or making rounds. He found the register on the desk, turned it, scanned the names until he found one that was almost right. Elena Voss. Her maiden name, not her married name. Not an alias, just the name that had been hers before him, which told him something about the state of mind she'd been in when she checked in. Room 214, second floor. He took the stairs. The staircase was narrow, the carpet runner worn thin down the middle, the overhead light doing minimal work. His footsteps were silent by habit. He came out onto the second-floor corridor and stopped for 3 full seconds, reading the space. A window at the far end. 4 doors on each side. The smell of ocean salt coming through the building's old bones. Room 214 was 4 doors down on the left. He walked to it. He raised his hand. He stood there with his knuckles an inch from the door and felt something move through him that he could not name and would not have named aloud even if he could. A compound thing made of 8 months of absence and the image of an ultrasound envelope falling to a marble floor and the particular sound of her name in his own voice in an empty apartment at 2 in the morning. He knocked. The silence that followed lasted long enough that he thought she might not answer. Long enough that he raised his hand to knock again and then stopped when he heard movement behind the door. Careful, deliberate movement. The sound of someone who does not open doors at 2 in the morning without first understanding who is on the other side. Who is it? Her voice. Through the door, flat and controlled, and not afraid because Elena Voss had never been afraid of what she couldn't see. His throat did something unexpected. "It's me," he said. The silence on the other side of the door was a different quality now. It had weight in it. Cassian, not a question. A recognition with a hard edge on it, like something being picked up that you know is going to cut you. "Elena, I need you to open the door, please. I know you have no reason to. I know that. But there are people coming to this address tonight, and I need you to let me in right now." Another silence. He could feel her on the other side of the door. Could feel the particular quality of her stillness, the way she would be standing with her hand near the lock but not on it, processing every variable. "How did you find me?" she said. "I'll explain everything, every single thing, but Elena, please, right now I need." The door opened. She stood in the doorway and the hallway light fell on her, and Cassian Moretti, who had not cried since he was 12 years old and watching his father's coffin from across the street, felt something in his face do something he couldn't control, because the woman standing in front of him was visibly, undeniably, breathtakingly pregnant, and she was looking at him with the eyes of someone who has already decided not to break, and the combination of those two things, the life she was carrying, the armor she had built, hit him somewhere central and permanent. She saw his face. She looked away first. "Come in," she said, flat, professional. The voice she used when she was managing a situation rather than feeling it. He came in. The room was small, meticulously kept. A single lamp on the nightstand. A laptop on the small desk with tabs open to what looked like medical information. A suitcase in the corner that was neither fully unpacked nor ready to leave. The suitcase of a person who has been in the process of deciding whether to stay for some time. Elena had moved to the far side of the room. She stood with the bed between them, her arms crossed over her middle. Not the defensive posture it might have looked like from the outside. He understood, but the instinctive protective posture of a woman whose primary concern in the room was not herself. He looked at her. She looked at him with eyes that had been through 8 months of alone and had arrived at a specific kind of equilibrium that was not the same thing as peace. "Talk," she said. "What you saw at the hotel. I know what I saw. You saw what someone spent 6 weeks building for you to see." He kept his voice level. He needed her to hear the content, not the emotion under it. Not yet. "The woman, the shirt, Elena, that shirt was taken from our apartment. The cufflinks you gave me were taken and returned. Vivian Hale was paid $2 million to spend 45 minutes in that suite and walk out that door at the precise moment you stepped off the elevator." She said nothing. Her face did not change. The hotel surveillance was wiped. I had it reconstructed. "There's a man in the stairwell doorway watching you walk to the elevator. I know who he is. I know who built this. Cassian." Her voice was very quiet. "Do you understand how that sounds?" "I know how it sounds. It sounds like every man who's ever been caught saying, 'I know what it sounds like.' I know." He took a step forward and stopped himself. "I know. I am not asking you to believe me on my word. I have the footage. I have documented evidence of wire transfers to Vivian Hale. I have a paper trail connecting." "Stop." She put her hand up, flat. The gesture she used when a conversation was moving faster than she could process. And he stopped immediately because in 7 years, he had learned that her boundaries were not negotiable and that respecting them was the one thing he had always done right. She pressed her fingers to her temple. Her eyes closed for 3 seconds. When they opened, they were very clear. You're telling me someone did all of that, staged all of that, to break up our marriage? Yes, why? Because breaking us up was the first step. The actual target is me. He paused. The actual target was always me. You were the instrument. She absorbed this. He watched her absorb it. Watched the particular way her mind worked, the way she turned information over and looked at it from structural angles before she responded, which was one of the things that had made him fall for her in the first place. This woman who thought before she spoke in a world where everyone around him operated on impulse. Who? She asked. He told her. She went very still. Silas, she said. Yes, Silas, who came to our wedding, who sat at our table at Christmas. Who called me after my mother died and stayed on the phone for an hour. Yes. The sound she made was not a cry and not a laugh. It was the sound of someone recalibrating the past against a new map and finding that every remembered landmark is in the wrong place. She sat down on the edge of the bed slowly. The careful movement of a woman in the final stage of pregnancy, navigating physical space. And she put both hands on her stomach and looked at the floor. How long, she said. How long has he been? I don't have the full picture yet. What I have is enough to know he has people coming here tonight. That's why I drove. That's why I'm here. He crossed to her then, closed the distance, went down on one knee in front of her so their eyes were level, and she didn't have to look up at him, which was an instinctive thing he did without planning it. And he said, I have to get you out of here, right now. And I have to know that you understand. I need you to understand that I did not betray you. I have never once in 7 years looked at another woman. You are the only thing in my life that I have never lied to. She looked at him. Her eyes were doing something complicated that he couldn't read, which was unusual because he could almost always read Elena. The baby, she said. I know. You know. I figured it out on the drive. The envelope. I should have. Elena, I should have. Don't. Her voice cracked on the word just slightly. The first crack in the surface of all that careful control. Don't you dare apologize for that right now. Not right now. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for a moment. How many people are coming? He didn't know the exact number. He told her so. But we leave now before they arrive. I have the car on the street. I have. The window at the far end of the room exploded inward, not glass breaking from a stone. The specific concussive implosion of a window hit by something traveling at velocity. And the sound of it went through the small room like a physical blow. And Elena was already moving, already off the bed and toward the interior wall. The deep instinct of a woman who had spent 7 years in proximity to violence and had absorbed more about surviving it than she had ever acknowledged. Cassian was up and moving before the glass finished falling. He got to her, got his body between her and the window, and said into her ear, "Stay low. Stay behind me. Don't stop moving no matter what you hear." She grabbed his arm. Her grip was ferocious. "Cassian, I've got you." He looked at her for exactly 1 second, which was all either of them could afford. "I've got you. Move." They went into the corridor. The corridor was not empty. 2 men at the far end by the stairwell moving fast and with the compressed efficiency of trained professionals. One of them saw Cassian and the other saw Elena, and for a fraction of a second the arrangement of the scene was being processed. And Cassian used that fraction of a second the way he'd been using moments like it since he was 19 years old, throwing himself forward and to the left so the angle changed, and they were no longer between him and a clean line to the window at the corridor's opposite end. The next 90 seconds were not cinematic. They were loud and close and brutal in the way of real violence, which is never graceful and rarely quick. Cassian took a hit to the shoulder that would leave him unable to fully rotate the joint for 2 weeks, and he gave back considerably more than he took because the alternative was not an option he was processing. Elena had pressed herself into the alcove of a doorway behind him and was doing exactly what he had told her. Staying low, staying behind him, not stopping. When the corridor was quiet again, Cassian was breathing in the jagged, involuntary way of a man whose body has been running on adrenaline and is now demanding an accounting. He looked back at her. She was pressed against the door, both hands on her stomach, eyes wide but clear, scared but functional. He had always loved that about her, that in a crisis she became somehow more present rather than less. "Are you?" "I'm fine. The baby's fine." She said it before he could finish asking. "Cassian, there are more. Downstairs." "I heard them before you knocked." He'd heard them, too. 3 sets of footsteps at minimum on the floor below, moving in the coordinated pattern of people who know the building's layout, which meant they'd been here before or had plans. "Back staircase," he asked. "End of the hall. There's a door to the kitchen and a service exit to the parking lot." He looked at her. "You scoped the exits." "I've been living in your world for 7 years," she said. "Move." They moved. The back staircase was narrow and dark, and they went down it fast, Cassian slightly ahead with his hand back to keep contact with her arm, and they came out through a swinging kitchen door into a space that smelled of commercial cleaner and cold grease. The service exit was a steel door with a push bar. He went through it first. The parking lot behind the hotel was dark, lit by a single overhead fixture at the far corner, and for 3 seconds it appeared to be clear. Then a figure stepped from the shadow of a delivery truck parked along the rear fence. And Cassian recognized, with a specific and nauseating clarity, that this was not one of Silas's hired men. This was Silas. He was in a dark coat, hands in his pockets, and he looked exactly as he always looked. Unhurried, warm-faced, completely at ease. The ease of a man who had arrived at a place he had been moving toward for 11 years and found it exactly as he had imagined. "Cassian," he said, as if they were meeting for coffee. As if 11 years and 2 bodies in a hotel corridor and a pregnant woman standing in a parking lot at 2 in the morning were just the current coordinates of a conversation that had no particular urgency. Cassian stopped. Elena's hand tightened on his arm. "Step away from her," Silas said. "This doesn't have to be complicated. Walk away. The organization passes to me, the liability disappears with it. And she." He glanced at Elena with something that was almost genuine regret. "She goes somewhere quiet and raises the child away from all of this. Which, honestly, is better than what she'd have if she stayed in your orbit. You know that's true. You had men sent to kill her," Cassian said. His voice was completely flat. "I had men sent to relocate her. The child is Moretti blood. I'm not. Don't." Cassian's voice dropped to something below flat, into a register that the men who worked with him longest knew to recognize as the specific precursor to irreversible action. "Don't tell me what you are and aren't. I've been listening to what you are for 11 years, and I was too close to see it clearly. I'm not close anymore." Silas looked at him for a moment. The warmth drained out of his face the way warmth drains when a man stops performing it. And what was underneath was not cold exactly. It was simply accurate, the expression of a person who has decided to stop maintaining the fiction. "You should have stayed in Newark," Silas said. "If you'd stayed in Newark, this could have resolved itself cleanly. You'd have lost the organization, yes, but you'd have been alive. You'd have been alive, and eventually you might have found her, and you might have had some version of the thing you wanted." He tilted his head slightly. "Instead, you drove 300 miles in the middle of the night, and now you're standing in a parking lot. And I have 6 men in that building and 2 more at the vehicle you came in. And the math on this situation is..." "Cassian, you're an intelligent man. You understand the math." Cassian did understand the math. He also understood something that Silas did not, which was that Terrio had received a message 40 minutes ago with the name of this hotel. And Terrio was the kind of man who did not wait to be told twice what an emergency looked like. He needed 11 minutes. He needed 11 minutes, and he needed to keep Silas talking, which would normally be a simple task, because Silas Romano had spent his entire adult life saying things that sounded like one thing while meaning another, and he had never once in Cassian's experience passed up the opportunity to be heard. "Tell me why," Cassian said. Silas blinked, a small, genuine surprise. "Why?" "You've been building this for 11 years. Inside my house, sleeping in my guest room, standing in my wedding photographs." He kept his voice level, conversational, almost. "I want to know why. A beat." Silas looked at him with the expression of a man deciding how honest to be. He decided apparently on very honest, because this was the moment, and even the most controlled people have things they've been waiting to say. Your father killed mine, Silas said. The parking lot was very quiet. He ordered it, Silas continued, in the same tone of voice one uses to explain something straightforward. 1987. My father was working for your father's organization, and he found something he shouldn't have found, and he was removed because your father didn't leave problems in place. He removed them. He looked at Cassian. I was 8 years old. My mother worked 2 jobs until I was 18. I came to your father's organization at 24, and I spent 6 years learning the structure before he died, and then I spent 11 years in your organization learning the rest. He paused. I was patient. You were patient, Cassian repeated. 11 years is a long time to be patient. 11 years is a long time to be patient, Cassian agreed, and his voice was doing the thing it did when he was holding the very center of himself completely still. And somewhere in those 11 years you made a calculation that my wife was an acceptable casualty, that the child she's carrying was an acceptable casualty. And I need you to understand, Silas, that the man who made that calculation, whatever your reasons, whatever was done to your father, that man is not walking out of this parking lot making any further decisions about what is and isn't acceptable. Silas looked at him. For the first time in 11 years, something moved behind those warm, patient eyes that was not calculation. He reached into his coat pocket. The sound that came from the far end of the parking lot, from the direction of the street, was the sound of multiple vehicles arriving at speed without headlights. And Silas turned toward it with the reflexive alertness of a professional. And in the moment that his attention moved, Elena Voss, who had been standing at Cassian's side with both hands on her stomach, and her breathing controlled, and her eyes tracking everything in the parking lot with the focused attention of a woman who had already decided she was not going to be a victim in this story, reached into the pocket of her coat and produced the compact canister of pepper spray she'd been carrying every day for 8 months. She didn't hesitate. She was 4 feet from Silas when she used it. The sound he made was involuntary and human in a way that nothing else about him that night had been. And he went backward and down onto one knee, and the weapon in his hand discharged into the asphalt. And Cassian was already moving, already crossing the distance, coming down on Silas, with the specific controlled violence of a man settling a debt that has been accumulating for 11 years and has just come fully due. Terrio's vehicles came through the parking lot gate 30 seconds later. It was, Cassian would think afterward, almost exactly 11 minutes. Almost exactly. He straightened up from where Silas was restrained on the ground and turned to find Elena standing 6 feet away. Still holding the canister, breathing hard, looking at him with an expression that was not triumph and was not relief, and was not any of the things that the movies would have you expect from a woman who has just survived the worst night of her life. It was something closer to the expression of a person who has discovered, under the most unfavorable possible circumstances, exactly what they're capable of. Then her face changed. She pressed both hands against her stomach, and her breath caught in a different way. A sharp, involuntary catch, and she looked at Cassian with eyes that had gone from clear and controlled to something entirely immediately else. Cassian, she said, her voice was very quiet. I think it's time, she said. The nearest hospital was 19 miles inland. Cassian knew this because in the 11 minutes he had been waiting for Terrio, he had mapped every variable in the surrounding area the way he always mapped variables. Automatically, compulsively. The survival habit of a man who had spent his adult life in environments where the distance to the nearest exit was information you needed before you needed it. He had Elena in the back seat of Terrio's vehicle before Silas had finished being secured, one arm around her shoulders, his other hand holding hers, and she was breathing in the controlled rhythmic pattern of a woman who had clearly spent the last several months preparing for exactly this physical experience and was now applying everything she learned while simultaneously processing the fact that she had just incapacitated a man at gunpoint in a parking lot in the middle of the night. Contractions, she said between breaths. Started maybe an hour ago. I thought it was stress. How far apart? 6 minutes when I was in the room, closer now. Cassian leaned forward to Terrio in the front seat. Fastest route to the hospital. Don't stop for anything. Terrio already had his phone up. He was a man who did not require instructions twice. The vehicle was moving before he finished the sentence, pulling out of the parking lot and onto the coastal road, with the engine doing everything it had. Cassian settled back. Elena's hand was in both of his now, and she was leaning against him with the unself-conscious weight of a woman who has temporarily set down the 8 months of careful, deliberate distance she'd been maintaining and is simply for this moment where she needs to be. He felt her breathing against his chest. He felt the tension that ran through her when a contraction peaked and the careful release of it when it passed. He did not speak. There was nothing that could be said in the back of a moving vehicle on a dark coastal road that would cover what needed to be said, and he was not going to attempt it because Elena Voss was a woman who could identify the difference between genuine language and the management of a situation, and she deserved the first kind or nothing. Cassian, she said during a lull, I'm here. The men in the hotel, are they? Terrio's people are handling it. She absorbed this. Another contraction moved through her, and he felt it in the grip of her hand, the pressure of it climbing and then releasing. She breathed through it with her eyes closed. The footage you said you have, she said when she could. The wire transfers. I have them. You're going to need to move on Silas fast before he can reach anyone who, Elena. He said her name very quietly. Not right now. A pause. Then, against his shoulder, I've been alone with this for 8 months. I've been making every decision by myself for 8 months. Old habit. I know. He pressed his mouth briefly to the top of her head. The gesture of a man who is done pretending he isn't feeling what he's feeling. I know. I've got it. I need you to let me have it for a while. She didn't answer, but her hand adjusted in his, loosened slightly, then resettled. The physical equivalent of a person choosing to put something down. The hospital lights appeared through the windshield 12 minutes later, and Cassian felt something in his chest that he recognized distantly as relief. And that was immediately followed by something considerably more complicated, because what was happening right now. The sliding doors and the bright fluorescent light and the wheelchair appearing from nowhere, and Elena being transitioned from his hands into the competent hands of people whose entire professional purpose was the successful arrival of new life. All of it was something he had spent 7 years imagining in a completely different register. In the version of the future, where it happened at the expected time in the expected way, rather than following a parking lot confrontation at 2:30 in the morning. He walked alongside the wheelchair until they told him he couldn't. And then he stopped in a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and industrial floor cleaner, and watched a set of double doors close between him and his wife with the very specific sensation of a man who has just been reminded that there are categories of situation over which no amount of power, preparation, or ruthlessness provides any leverage whatsoever. He stood in the corridor. He put his back against the wall and slid down it until he was sitting on the floor with his knees up and his head back against the tile, and his hands hanging loose between his knees. His shoulder, where he'd taken the hit in the hotel corridor, was sending information to his brain that he'd been ignoring for the past 40 minutes, and was finding increasingly difficult to continue ignoring. He rotated it experimentally, not dislocated. Badly bruised, possibly a small fracture in the vicinity of the clavicle. He'd had worse. He'd had considerably worse and remained functional. He made a decision to continue ignoring it. His phone had 7 missed calls. 3 from Terrio, which were in the last 15 minutes, and were almost certainly status updates. 2 from a number he didn't recognize. 1 from Garfield, his attorney, which was unusual for this hour, and suggested that something had moved in the legal architecture of the situation. 1 from Jules. He called Jules first. The wire transfers, Jules said without preamble. Not through any attorney connected to your organization. The amendment was filed by a firm in Midtown that I've now connected to the same holding company. The documents indicated that you were waiving any right to contest the divorce and requesting immediate finalization. Cassian was very still on the hospital floor. I never filed any amendment. No. You didn't. Someone forged your signature on a legal document and filed it through a clean cutout, specifically to make sure Elena had no reason to question the finality of the divorce, to make sure she understood it as your choice. Cassian closed his eyes. So she hadn't just seen the hotel hallway and left. She had then received what appeared to be legal confirmation that he wanted her gone, that he was actively, officially in writing, choosing to end their marriage without contest or conversation. She had received documentation in his name that said, "This is what he wants. There is nothing left to discuss." He thought about her in that bus station in Pennsylvania. The emergency account, the suitcase that was neither fully unpacked nor ready to leave. 8 months of building a life alone from the rubble of something that had been systematically demolished by a man who had 11 years to learn exactly which walls were load-bearing. "Jules," he said, "can you make the connection between the forged documents and Silas Watertight? Within 48 hours. Yes, do it. Send everything to Garfield and to the federal contact I gave you last month. Everything. The surveillance footage, the wire transfers, the forged documents, the dockside access roster, all of it, simultaneously, so nothing can be intercepted before it lands. Understood, Cassian." Silas has allies inside the federal system. At least 2 people in positions where they could slow this down. I know who they are. I'm handling that separately. He ended the call. He called the unknown number. It rang once, and a woman's voice answered, low, precise, with the particular cadence of someone who has prepared what they're going to say. "Mr. Moretti, my name is Vivian Hale. I believe you've been looking for me." The corridor outside the maternity ward was very quiet. "I have," Cassian said. "I'm in the country. I came back 3 days ago. I want to make a statement, a full statement, on record, about everything I was asked to do, and everything I was paid to do, and everything I know about who gave the instructions." A pause. "I need something in return. Tell me what you need. Protection, real protection. Not a wire transfer to a foreign account. Someone to guarantee that Silas Romano's people can't find me before I can testify. You'll have it. You give your word that easily." "I give it once," Cassian said. "I don't repeat it. Where are you?" She gave him a hotel in Manhattan. He called Terrio immediately after and gave him the address and the name and the instruction to deploy the 2 most discreet and reliable men in his organization to that location in the next 45 minutes. Terrio asked no questions. Terrio had stopped asking questions approximately 6 years ago, having determined that the answers were consistently more complicated than the instructions, and that the instructions were always sufficient. Cassian put the phone in his pocket. He was still sitting on the hospital floor. He became aware slowly that the corridor was not entirely empty. A nurse had appeared at the far end and was looking at him with the practiced assessment of a medical professional evaluating a person sitting on an institutional floor at 3 in the morning, making determinations about whether this required intervention. He looked back at her. He was aware of how he looked. Dark coat, one shoulder sitting wrong, the particular quality of exhaustion that comes from adrenaline aftermath. A face that in the best of circumstances did not read as approachable. "I'm waiting," he said. "My wife is in there." The nurse looked at him for another moment. "There's a waiting room," she said, not unkindly gesturing with her chin. "I know," he said. "I'm good here." She left him there. He appreciated that. At 4:17 in the morning, a different set of double doors opened on the other side of the building. Silas Romano had been transported by Terrio's people to a location that was not a police station and not a hospital, and had no official designation of any kind. A fact that Silas understood completely when he arrived there, and which informed the particular adjustment he made to his posture and expression as he was settled into a chair in a room that was clean, well lit, and contained nothing except 2 chairs and a table. And the understanding, implicit and absolute, that what happened in this room was entirely contingent on choices Silas was about to make. Across the table from him was a man named Brennan, who worked for Cassian in a capacity that had no official title and required a very specific kind of temperament, the kind that could conduct a prolonged conversation with a dangerous person in a confined space, without any of the variables becoming unmanageable. Brennan put a recorder on the table. Silas looked at it. Mr. Moretti would prefer a conversation. Brennan said, he would prefer that you understand the current situation clearly before you make any decisions about how to proceed. Silas's eyes were red from the pepper spray, and his wrists were zip-tied to the chair's arms. And he had the controlled expression of a man who has run several scenarios in his head during the ride here, and arrived at a landscape that is not catastrophic if managed correctly. He was still running them. Cassian could see it, even on the feed from the small camera in the room's upper corner. That particular quality of concentration behind the eyes, the processor still working even when the situation surrounding it has deteriorated significantly. Where's Moretti? Silas asked. Occupied, Brennan said. A flicker. Silas recalibrated. The woman. Mr. Moretti is occupied, Brennan repeated pleasantly. What he has asked me to convey to you is this. As of approximately 40 minutes ago, federal authorities received a comprehensive package of documentation connecting you to conspiracy, forgery, money laundering, and the ordering of violence against a civilian. That package is in the hands of people whose cooperation you have historically relied on, and whose cooperation has been, this is Mr. Moretti's phrasing, rendered unavailable by conversations he had earlier this evening. Brennan folded his hands on the table. He would like to know whether, given those circumstances, you would prefer to assist in completing the evidentiary record, or whether you would prefer to wait and allow the federal process to proceed without your input. Silas looked at the recorder. He looked at Brennan. He looked at the camera in the corner, which he had identified in the first 40 seconds of being in the room. Tell Cassian, he said slowly, that I want to speak with him directly. Mr. Moretti is occupied. I understand that. The controlled expression shifted very slightly. A degree of something surfacing that was not quite desperation, but was adjacent to it. Tell him I have information he doesn't have about the federal contacts, about things in his organization that go beyond what I was managing directly. Things that will matter to him more than anything I can provide on paper. He paused. Tell him there's a name he hasn't found yet. Brennan looked at him for a moment. He picked up his phone and typed a message. The message arrived on Cassian's phone at 4:22, while he was still in the hospital corridor, while the double doors at the end of the hall were still closed against him, while every variable in the external situation was being managed by other people so that he could be exactly where he was. He read it. He typed back, "Tell him I'm listening. Record everything. I'll review in the morning." Then he put the phone away. Because the doors at the end of the corridor had just opened, and the nurse who had found him sitting on the floor 40 minutes ago was walking toward him with a different expression on her face now. The specific expression of someone carrying information that is entirely good. He was on his feet before she reached him. "Your wife is doing very well," she said. "She's asking for you." He followed her through the doors. The room was small and bright and smelled of antiseptic, and the particular complicated air of a space where something enormous has just occurred. Elena was in the bed with her hair escaping in every direction, and her face doing the thing faces do after prolonged and extreme physical labor. Scraped clean of everything except the essential, which in Elena's case was a kind of fierce, unguarded openness he had not seen on her face in 8 months. She was holding their son. The child was red-faced and indignant, looking in the way of newborns who have just been evicted from the only home they had ever known and were not prepared to be philosophical about it. He was wrapped in a hospital blanket, and he was very small, and he had his eyes open. Unfocused the way newborns' eyes are, seeing light and movement and nothing yet specific, and he was making a sound that was somewhere between complaining and announcing himself to the general premises. Cassian stopped inside the door. His brain, which had been running at sustained maximum capacity for approximately 7 hours, simply stopped running. He looked at this woman and this child and felt something move through him that reorganized everything, that reached back through 20 years of carefully constructed hardness and moved through it like it wasn't there. The way water moves through stone eventually, not by force, but by being exactly and persistently what it is. Elena looked up. Her eyes were exhausted and red-rimmed and entirely completely present. "Come here," she said. He crossed the room. He sat on the edge of the bed beside her, and she shifted slightly to make room, and he looked at the child, his son. This small, ferocious creature who had arrived into the world at 4:26 in the morning, following a parking lot confrontation and a 19-mile drive and 8 months of his father not knowing he existed. "He's got your jaw," Elena said. Cassian looked at the jaw in question. It was the jaw of a creature who weighed approximately 7 pounds and had opinions about the temperature of the room. He could not immediately identify it as resembling anything. He said so. "Give it a week," Elena said. "It'll settle." He looked at her. She looked at him. They were very close in the small hospital bed, his shoulder touching hers, and the weight of everything that lay between them. The 8 months and the manufactured betrayal and the forged documents and the distance she'd built with such careful, necessary precision was present in the room with them. Not gone, not resolved, but temporarily and completely outweighed by the fact that they were both here and the child was here. And none of them were in a parking lot anymore. "What's his name?" Cassian asked. They had talked about names once, early in their marriage. The hypothetical conversation that couples have before the hypothetical becomes specific. She had liked family names. He had argued mildly against the tradition of naming sons after fathers in his family, given that the tradition had a fairly grim track record. Elena looked down at the child. Her thumb moved across his forehead, the lightest possible touch, something she was probably not aware she was doing. "Luca," she said. "I'd like to call him Luca." Cassian looked at his son. "Luca," he said. The child moved his unfocused eyes in the general direction of the sound. His small face arranged itself into an expression of intense and inconclusive deliberation. "Okay," Cassian said. "Luca." They sat there in the small, bright room, while the sky outside the window began its slow shift from black to the dark blue that precedes dawn. And neither of them spoke for a while, because the conversation that needed to happen between them was too large for this room tonight, and they both knew it. And neither of them was going anywhere. Then Cassian's phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. It buzzed again. Elena made the small sound of someone returning from a great distance to the practical world. "You should check it," she said. "Not right now, Cassian." Her voice was gentle and direct in equal measure. "Check it. Whatever's happening outside this room is not going to stop happening because you're in this room." He looked at her. "Check it," she said. "Then come back." He pulled the phone out. The message was from Terrio. 4 words and a location. Silas broke. He's talking. And then in a second message sent 30 seconds later, "There's a name. You need to hear this now. It changes everything." Cassian read the messages twice. He felt the specific quality of stillness that preceded major recalibration. The pause before a man who has been running in one direction understands that the map he's been using has a section he hasn't looked at yet. He looked up at Elena. She was watching him with the eyes of a woman who has spent 7 years reading this face and knows every register of what it contains. "How bad?" she asked. "I don't know yet. But it's not over." "No." He put the phone away. His jaw was set, and his shoulder was sending complaints he continued to decline to process. And his son was 7 minutes old, and his wife was looking at him with something in her expression that was not forgiveness yet, and was not trust yet, but was the specific thing that comes before both of those. The decision to remain present long enough to see whether they become possible. "Go," she said. "Elena, Luca and I are not going anywhere." She looked down at the child, then back at him. "Go handle whatever it is. Come back." He stood up from the bed. He looked at her for one more second. He looked at his son. He reached out and put his hand very carefully on the top of Luca's head, the lightest contact, barely a touch, just enough to confirm that this was real, that this small, warm weight existed in the actual physical world, and not only in the space where he'd been carrying the idea of him for the last 7 hours. Luca's eyes moved. Cassian withdrew his hand and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame. "I'm not going to ask you to trust me," he said without turning around. "Not tonight. Not yet. I'm just going to come back. A beat." "I know," Elena said. He walked out. The drive back toward the city took 40 minutes at this hour, the eastern sky going from dark blue to the particular gray pink of approaching dawn. And Cassian drove with one hand on the wheel and his mind running through everything Terrio had sent in the interval. The preliminary notes from Silas's confession. The name he hadn't found. The architecture of something that was considerably larger and more embedded than he had understood. The name Silas had given wasn't inside his organization. It was above it. A federal prosecutor named Wainwright, who had been conducting what appeared to be a legitimate investigation into Moretti finances for the past 18 months, and who had simultaneously been receiving payments from Silas's shell company, and who had been not investigating the Moretti organization, but constructing a case that would provide Silas with the legal mechanism to seize and legitimize the organization's financial holdings in the event of Cassian's arrest or death. Not a conspiracy to destroy Cassian Moretti, a conspiracy to absorb everything he built. 11 years of patience aimed not at revenge for a father's death, or not only that, but at acquisition, inheritance by force, the organization, the accounts, the infrastructure, the alliances. All of it transferred cleanly and legally to a man whose name wasn't on a single document anywhere, but whose fingerprints were on every mechanism that would make the transfer happen. Cassian pulled off the highway at a rest stop and sat with the engine running. He looked at the gray dawn coming up over the tree line. He thought about the prosecutor, about the case files that were probably already built and waiting that could be activated. The moment Silas gave a signal from wherever he was supposed to be right now, which was not zip-tied to a chair in a warehouse, but somewhere with plausible distance from the events of the evening. He thought about the documentation Jules had sent to the federal contact, his federal contact versus Silas's federal prosecutor. The math was not comfortable. He pulled back onto the highway. He called Garfield. The attorney answered on the second ring, which meant he hadn't been sleeping, which meant he already knew something was in motion. "Tell me you have something I can use tonight," Cassian said. "Vivian Hale's attorney called an hour ago," Garfield said. "She's prepared to give a full recorded statement. She also has documentation, her own documentation. Apparently she kept records, which is either foolish or extraordinarily useful depending on your perspective. Connecting the staging at the Alderton Hotel directly to instructions she received through a law firm, I can now connect to Silas Romano." A pause. "Cassian, if this goes where I think it's going, we're not talking about a criminal matter anymore. We're talking about federal conspiracy charges against a sitting federal prosecutor. That opens a different category of door." "Open it," Cassian said. "It means everything comes out. Your organization, your history. Things I've spent 15 years helping you keep at arm's length from official record. Open the door, Garfield." A longer pause this time. The sound of a man recalibrating a 15-year professional relationship in real time. "There will be a cost," Garfield said. "Personal cost. Things you've built will have to be surrendered as part of any arrangement that protects you in the short term and legitimizes your position long term." "I know. You know. I've been thinking about cost all night," Cassian said. "I'm prepared to pay it. Open the door." He ended the call. The sun was breaking the horizon ahead of him. The specific blinding low angle of early morning sun that makes the highway look like it's made of light. And Cassian drove toward it with his jaw set and his shoulder throbbing, and the name Luca sitting somewhere in the center of his chest where it had taken up residence the moment Elena had said it. Warm and specific and already permanent. He had an organization beginning to fracture under a conspiracy that went deeper than he mapped. He had a federal prosecutor who was part of that conspiracy and who had an 18-month head start on the legal architecture of Cassian's destruction. He had an underboss in a warehouse talking finally, after 11 years of silence. And that talking was going to unravel things on all sides. Not just Silas's side, but Cassian's own history. The 2 decades of it that didn't bear the kind of scrutiny that federal testimony produced. He had a wife in a hospital room holding a 7-pound person who had his jaw, apparently, and who would require from his father things that no empire and no amount of carefully managed power could substitute for. He drove. The city appeared on the horizon ahead of him, the familiar skyline resolving out of the dawn light. And Cassian looked at it with the eyes of a man who had spent 20 years building something in those streets that he now understood with complete and irreversible clarity he was going to have to partially destroy in order to deserve what he just left in a hospital room 19 miles behind him. His phone rang. The screen said Wainwright, Federal, the prosecutor, calling him directly. At 5:43 in the morning, which meant Wainwright knew the night's events had not gone according to the plan he'd been party to, and was making a move before the documentation Cassian had sent could be acted upon. And this call was either an attempt at negotiation or the opening of something considerably more dangerous. And Cassian had approximately 3 seconds to decide which it was before he had to answer. He looked at the phone. He looked at the road. He answered, "Mr. Wainwright," he said, "Mr. Moretti." The voice on the other end was smooth, controlled. The professional voice of a man who prosecuted people for a living and had learned to sound reasonable while doing it. "I think we should talk before this morning gets any further away from both of us." "I agree," Cassian said. "Good." A pause. "Because I want you to understand something very clearly before you make any decisions based on what your people sent to my colleagues tonight." Another pause. This one calibrated for maximum impact. "I have a sealed indictment, your name on it, signed 6 weeks ago and sitting in a safe in my office. I can have it unsealed and served before 9 this morning." The voice stayed smooth, stayed reasonable. "Or we can have a conversation about what a mutually beneficial arrangement might look like, given where things currently stand." Cassian felt the road under the car and the dawn light coming through the windshield and the weight of 20 years and one night and one small face with its eyes open and not yet focused on anything. "Mr. Wainwright," he said, and his voice was very calm. The specific calm of a man who has decided in this moment on this road, with the sun coming up ahead of him, that there is exactly one way through what's in front of him, and that it is going to cost him more than he has ever paid for anything. "Go ahead," said the prosecutor. "I'm going to decline the arrangement," Cassian said. "And then I'm going to tell you exactly why declining is the last mistake you're going to make in this particular career. And then I'm going to let you decide what to do with the next 4 hours before the documentation that is already in transit reaches people you cannot reach." A silence. "You want to play it that way," Wainwright said, and the smoothness had an edge in it now. "I'm not playing anything," Cassian said. "I'm done playing. Unseal the indictment if that's your move. I'll be at my attorney's office at 8. Bring whatever you have." He ended the call. He pressed his foot down on the accelerator. Ahead of him, the city waited, indifferent as ever, running its ordinary operations in the early morning light, entirely unaware that the most feared man on the East Coast was driving toward it, having just made the decision that was going to dismantle 2 decades of carefully constructed power and replace it with something that had no name yet. But that felt for the first time, in as long as he could remember, like the correct direction. His shoulder hurt like hell. He didn't care. He drove. Garfield's office occupied the 14th floor of a building on Broad Street that had been housing attorneys since before Cassian was born. And at 7:58 in the morning, it contained, in addition to Garfield himself, 2 federal agents from a division that operated independently of the prosecutor's office. A woman from the Attorney General's office, who had driven up from Washington overnight and had the particular alert exhaustion of someone running on significance rather than sleep, and a laptop opened to a secure file transfer that Jules had completed at 6:47 a.m., containing 412 documents, 19 audio files, and 11 minutes of reconstructed surveillance footage from the Alderton Hotel. Cassian arrived at exactly 8. He had stopped at his apartment for 20 minutes, showered, changed his shirt, had the shoulder looked at by a man who made house calls for specific clients, and confirmed what Cassian already knew. Hairline fracture of the clavicle. Taped it. Told him not to lift anything over 10 pounds for 6 weeks. Received a look in return that suggested this instruction would not be followed. He looked when he walked into Garfield's office like a man who had slept adequately and had no particular feelings about the morning, which was the most useful lie his face had told in 20 years of telling useful lies. The woman from the AG's office introduced herself as Deputy AG Marlowe. She was 50-something short, with reading glasses she kept taking off and putting back on in a rhythm that suggested she was someone who thought better when her hands were occupied. I've been reviewing what your attorney provided overnight. I want to be direct with you about what we're looking at. Please, Cassian said. He sat down. Garfield sat beside him. The federal agents remained standing in that particular way of federal agents, positioned near the door without blocking it, present without participating. What you've provided, Marlowe said, is sufficient to support federal conspiracy charges against Assistant U.S. Attorney Wainwright, a sitting federal officer. That is not a small thing. That is, frankly, the kind of thing that generates significant institutional resistance, regardless of the quality of the evidence, because prosecutors prosecuting prosecutors creates a perception problem that the department actively works to avoid. She held his gaze. Which means the evidence has to be airtight. It's airtight, Cassian said. We'll determine that. What I can tell you is that based on what I've seen in the last 3 hours, we have probable cause for an immediate suspension of Wainwright's activities pending investigation, which neutralizes the sealed indictment he threatened you with last night. She paused. You understand that the indictment itself is not without basis. The investigation into your organization over the past 18 months, while conducted in bad faith by a compromised officer, produced documentation that the department will not simply set aside. I know, Cassian said. Whatever arrangement exists here, she chose that word carefully. Regarding your cooperation and the information you've provided will not extend to a blanket immunity for your prior activities. I'm not asking for blanket immunity. She looked at him over her glasses. What are you asking for? Cassian looked at the window. The city was fully awake outside it now. The morning sun hitting the glass towers at angles that turned them briefly gold before the light moved. He looked at it for a moment. The city he spent 20 years operating inside like a current operates inside water, invisible and everywhere at once. I'm asking for a process that's honest, he said. I'm asking that what I did and what Silas Romano did be treated as 2 separate categories of thing. I'm asking that the people in my organization who were not party to Romano's conspiracy, who were in some cases actively working against it, receive consideration proportionate to what they actually did. He looked back at her. And I'm asking that the woman in a hospital in a coastal town 19 miles from here and the child she had this morning have no part of any of this. Legally, practically, in any public record. They're not part of my organization. They never were. Whatever comes for me doesn't come for them. Marlowe looked at him for a long moment. That last part, she said, is not something I need to formalize. That's just the law. I know what the law says. I'm asking you to confirm it's what happens. It's what happens, she said. Cassian nodded once. He looked at Garfield. Garfield had his pen out and his legal pad open and was already writing. The meeting lasted 4 hours. By the time it ended, the following things had occurred or been set in motion. Wainwright had been contacted by the AG's office at 9:15 and placed on administrative suspension pending investigation. A call that Cassian's contact told him later had lasted 6 minutes and had ended with Wainwright going very quiet in the specific way of men who have spent careers understanding legal jeopardy and have just encountered it personally for the first time. The sealed indictment had been removed from active status and placed under review, which in practical terms meant it was not going anywhere this morning or any morning in the near future. Silas Romano's full confession, recorded in a warehouse in the early hours of the morning by a man named Brennan, who had 17 years of experience conducting exactly this kind of conversation, had been transferred to federal custody along with Silas himself. He had been transported to a facility whose address was not being shared broadly. Vivian Hale had given her statement to Garfield's associate at 6 in the morning, 5 hours after calling Cassian from a Manhattan hotel. The statement was thorough. It was corroborated. It described in precise and lawyerly detail the nature of her engagement, the instructions she received, the compensation she was paid, and the meeting at which Silas Romano had outlined the purpose of the operation in terms that left no ambiguity about his intent. She described the timing of Elena's arrival as something that had been researched. that Silas had known Elena was at a prenatal appointment that morning, had known the address of the clinic, had known the timing of a routine procedure Elena was having, and calibrated the hotel departure accordingly. When Cassian's attorney read him this section of the statement in the middle of the 4-hour meeting, Cassian said nothing. His face did nothing. He made a small mark on the legal pad in front of him and moved on to the next point. Later, in the elevator going down, Garfield looked at him sideways and said, "You're holding together well." "I'm holding together fine," Cassian said. The shoulder is fine." Garfield looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who has known another man for 15 years and has learned which conversations to pursue and which to let rest. He let this one rest. The elevator opened on the lobby. "Cassian," Garfield said as they walked out. "I know," Cassian said, with a patience that was absolute and final. "I know exactly what I'm giving up. I'm giving it up anyway." He stopped on the sidewalk outside the building. The morning city moving past him in its ordinary, magnificent indifference. "Get me whatever I need to sign. Have it ready by the end of the week." He left Garfield on the sidewalk and got in the car and drove back toward the hospital. It was raining by the time he got there, not the threatening held-breath rain of weeks ago, but the lighter, more decided variety, the kind that settles in for the day without drama. He parked and walked through it without hurrying, and came through the hospital doors damp at the shoulders, and shook the water off his coat in the lobby with the unself-conscious practicality of a man with more significant things on his mind than his coat. The nurse he'd spoken to in the corridor the night before was at the station when he came through the maternity ward doors. She looked at him, registered the coat, the taped shoulder visible at the collar, the face that had been running on no sleep for going on 29 hours. "She's been asking about you," the nurse said. "How are they?" he asked. "Both well. He's eating. She's tired." A pause. "She's very tired, Mr. Moretti," she said. She wrote it down. "Room 214, she said, which was the same number as Elena's hotel room, which was the kind of coincidence that means nothing, and that Cassian noted anyway, because his brain had been cataloging details for so long it had stopped being able to stop. He knocked before entering. Elena said, "Come in," in a voice that was scraped down to its foundations. The voice of a woman who has been awake for nearly 24 hours, following an experience that makes most other physically demanding experiences look modest. She was sitting up in the bed with Luca against her chest, and the room was washed in the flat gray light of the rainy morning. And she looked at Cassian when he came in with eyes that were exhausted and red-rimmed and entirely clear. He pulled the chair from the corner to the side of the bed and sat down without asking and looked at his son. Luca was sleeping. He was sleeping with the absolute, uncomplicated commitment to unconsciousness that newborns achieve and that adults spend the rest of their lives trying to get back. His face slack and his hands curled into loose fists and his breathing so small and regular that Cassian found himself counting breaths without intending to. Some primitive supervisory function that had apparently activated without his permission. "How did it go?" Elena said. Not a question exactly. The tone of someone who has been running scenarios. He told her. Not everything. Some of it was not yet finalized, and some of it was information that involved specifics she didn't need, but the shape of it, the outcome, the essential facts. Wainwright suspended. Silas in federal custody. The documentation submitted and received by people above the level of corruption that Silas had managed to embed. He told her about Vivian Hale's statement and what it contained. He told her about the section of the statement describing the calibration of the afternoon. How Silas had known the timing of her appointment. How he'd built the trap around her specific movements. When he got to that part, Elena's face did something small and controlled. The suppression of a reaction. The deliberate choosing of composure. And she looked down at Luca and adjusted the blanket around him with the focused attention of a woman redirecting herself toward what's in front of her instead of what's behind. "He researched me," she said. "Yes, he knew about the appointment, yes." She was quiet for a moment. "I sat across from him at dinner 4 times last year. He came to my birthday. He called me after my mother died." She paused. "I liked him. I know." She stopped herself. Shook her head once slightly. "That's a specific kind of terrible." Yes, Cassian said. It is. The rain ran down the window. Luca's breathing went on, small and regular. In the hallway outside the room, the ordinary activity of a hospital morning moved past the door. Footsteps, a cartwheel, a voice paging someone from somewhere. The organization, Elena said, most of it goes part of the cooperation arrangement. There are legal businesses, the property holdings, a logistics company, 2 restaurants. Those stay because they're clean and always were. Everything else is surrendered or dissolved as part of the agreement. She looked at him. You agreed to that. I agreed to it. That's. She seemed to be looking for the right word. That's not a small thing. No. 20 years. 20 years, he agreed. He looked at his hands, which were resting on his knees with the stillness of hands that have, for the moment, nothing they need to do. It's not as hard as I expected it to be, he said, deciding to let it go. I thought it would be harder. He paused. I think I'd been holding on to it past the point where it was actually what I wanted, for a long time. I just didn't have a reason to put it down until I had a better reason. Elena was watching him. The particular watching of someone who has spent 7 years learning a face and is now reading a new configuration of it. What happens to you, she said. Personally, legally. 18 months, minimum, of active cooperation and testimony. Criminal exposure for prior activities in the organization that will result in either a negotiated plea or a trial. Garfield thinks negotiated plea is likely given the value of the Wainwright case and the Romano case together. He thinks house arrest or a suspended sentence is achievable. He thinks. Cassian stopped himself. He thinks the outcome is manageable. Manageable, Elena repeated. That's the word he used. That's a lawyer's word for something that is not actually fine. Yes, Cassian said. That's what it is. She looked at Luca. He looked at her. I'm not asking anything from you, he said. I want to say that clearly. Nothing that happened in the last 12 hours changes what I told you last night in this room. I'm not using this, Luca, or the situation, or any of it as leverage for something you haven't decided to give. He held her gaze. I'm his father. That's not contingent on anything else. I'd like to be present in his life in whatever way you decide is appropriate, and I'd like to earn the rest of it. And if you decide that what was done to us is not something you can move past, I will accept that, and I will still be his father. And I will still be. He stopped, corrected himself. I will still be whatever you need me to be, that isn't that. Elena looked at him for a long time. Outside, the rain had settled into its steady gray rhythm. You built something in 20 years, she said finally. Something that required a particular version of you to build it. Cold in certain places, closed in others, strategic about everything, including things that shouldn't require strategy. She shifted Luca gently against her chest. And I love that man. The whole man. The difficult parts of him and the rare parts of him. I want you to know that wasn't a mistake, even given everything. I don't love mistakes. He said nothing because she was not finished. What I don't know, she said, is who you are when the thing you built is gone. I don't know what's underneath it. I don't know if you know. She looked at him with the eyes of a woman who deals in honesty even when it costs her. And I'm not in a position to build something with a man I don't know. I know, he said. She looked down at Luca, then back up. Come to the appointments. Be here. Let me see who you are when there's nothing to manage and nothing to protect and nothing to be the boss of. Let me see you when it's just this. She gestured, a small tired movement that encompassed the room, the child, the rain, the ordinary morning. And we'll see. We'll see, Cassian said. That's all I have right now. That's enough, he said. And he meant it without qualification, which was, he realized, something he hadn't been able to do with that phrase for a very long time. To mean it cleanly, without the background calculation of whether enough was actually sufficient. It was enough. He reached out slowly, and she watched him do it, and he put his hand very carefully on Luca's back. The small, curved back of a sleeping child who was less than 12 hours old and was breathing in that small, regular way. And he left it there, and neither of them spoke for a while. And the rain went on doing what rain does, and the city went on doing what cities do. And in the room, there was just the sound of a child breathing, and 2 people sitting with the complicated weight of a future they hadn't yet built but had, for the first time, decided to attempt. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Cassian Moretti's life. and he had lived through weeks that would serve as reference points for strange for most people. He testified 4 times in the first month, twice in proceedings connected to the Romano conspiracy, once in the preliminary matter regarding Wainwright, once in a deposition related to the forged divorce documents that Garfield was pursuing through civil channels as a separate matter. He sat in rooms with federal attorneys and answered questions with the directness that his own lawyers occasionally had to restrain, because Cassian had decided that the performance of cooperation and actual cooperation were 2 different things, and the performance had cost him enough already. Silas Romano was indicted on 22 federal counts, including conspiracy, forgery, ordering violence against a civilian, and the attempted murder charge stemming from the events at the Coastal Hotel. He did this without significant negotiation and without visible emotion in a courtroom where Cassian was not present because Garfield had advised against it, and Cassian had for once in his life taken the advice. He heard about it from Terrio, who had attended and described it in the precise and economical language of a man who says exactly what he saw. He looked the same, Terrio said, the whole time, exactly the same as he always looked. "I know," Cassian said. "Doesn't that?" "I know," Cassian said again, in a way that ended the question, and Terrio, who had been with him long enough, let it end. Wainwright's case moved more slowly, as cases involving compromised federal officers always do, through a process characterized by institutional reluctance and careful document management, and the particular inertia of systems investigating themselves. It moved, though. Marlowe, to her credit, moved it. Garfield told Cassian 3 months in that it was going to result in a significant outcome and to be patient. And Cassian found, to his own mild surprise, that he was able to be patient about this particular thing in a way he had never been patient about anything. Because patience was easier when you had redirected the energy it required. He had redirected it. He attended every appointment Elena allowed, which in the first month was 1 a week, and in the second month was more. And in the third month had stopped being scheduled and had become instead the natural rhythm of a man who showed up at a specific coastal town on specific days and sat in a small hotel room that still smelled of salt air and rocked a child who had, as Elena had predicted, settled into a jaw that was unmistakably his father's. The negotiations with federal authorities regarding his own legal exposure took 6 months. 3 attorneys, 2 trips to Washington, and produced an outcome that Garfield described as the best achievable result, and that Cassian understood to mean not easy, not painless, but survivable. A negotiated plea to 2 counts, reduced from 9, related to financial crimes predating the Romano conspiracy, resulting in 2 years of supervised release and a permanent agreement to operate exclusively within legitimate business structures. No prison. Conditions that were restrictive and lasting, and that he accepted without negotiation, because the negotiation had already happened, and this was what remained after it. He signed the papers on a Tuesday morning in Garfield's office. He shook hands with the federal attorney who had overseen the agreement. A careful young man who had treated the entire process with professional courtesy, and who looked at Cassian when the signing was done with an expression that was impossible to read, and that Cassian didn't try to read. He walked out of the building. He stood on the sidewalk. He called Elena. "It's done," he said. A pause. He heard Luca in the background. The particular sound he'd learned to identify as the contentedly active sound, as distinct from the hungry sound and the distinctly unhappy sound. A vocabulary he was still building, but building steadily. "Come down this weekend," she said. "I'll be there Saturday morning," he said. "Okay," she said. And then, in a different register, quieter, "Cassian." "Yeah, good," she said. "Just that." One word in a voice that carried the weight of everything it stood in for. He said, "Yeah." He put the phone in his pocket. He walked down Broad Street in the direction of the parking structure, past the ordinary city morning, past the people moving through their ordinary lives, with their ordinary concerns and their ordinary griefs and their ordinary loves. And he felt the absence of 20 years of armor, with the same quality of sensation you feel when you put down something very heavy that you've been carrying so long you'd forgotten the carrying. Not relief exactly, and not lightness, but a kind of surprised accountability to your own weight. The discovery that you're heavier than you remembered when you're the only thing you're carrying. He had sold the Newark apartment 2 months ago. He had kept the photograph, the one from the main pier. The two of them squinting into the sun at something off camera that he'd remembered. Finally, 3 weeks ago. A seagull that had landed on the railing beside them and sat there with the absolute confidence of a creature who owned the waterfront. And Elena had laughed and said it looked exactly like his attorney. And he had laughed too. Real laughter, the kind that doesn't need to be managed. He was renting a place near the water now, a small house 3 miles from the coastal hotel where Luca had been born, and where Elena had been living in the room above the lobby where the salt air came through the old bones of the building. He had rented it without asking her about it, which she had noted when she saw it. And he had said he wasn't moving in on anything, he was just finding it easier to be close rather than far. She had looked at him with the measuring look he'd come to understand as her working something out. And then she'd said, "Come for dinner Saturday." And that had been 4 months ago. And the dinners had continued. And Luca had begun to produce sounds that were not words yet, but were directed at his father, with the specific intention of a person who has identified this individual as a fixed point in his world. Cassian had built a cradle. This was not a thing he had any particular history of doing. He was not a man who had spent time in his life in workshops, was not the kind of person who had woodworking as a hobby or any other hobby that required patience and manual work and the tolerance for imperfection. He had built it anyway. Over 3 weeks in the garage of the rental house, with tools he'd purchased and YouTube videos he'd watched with the same focused attention he'd once directed at tactical situations. And the result was something that was not elegant, but was solid and smooth, and finished in a pale oak that he'd chosen, because Elena's furniture ran toward light wood and warm tones. He'd carried it to the hotel himself. He'd knocked on the room door, which was still 214. Elena had opened it, and looked at the cradle and looked at him, and he had said, "I made it. It's not. I know it's not. It's beautiful," she said. He looked at it. It wasn't beautiful exactly. It was competent and careful, and built by hands that had done many things badly before they'd learned to do them adequately. "It's solid," he said. "That's the same thing," Elena said. She stepped back from the door and let him bring it in. He set it down beside the window where the salt air came through, and Luca had regarded it from Elena's arms, with the solemn, evaluative expression of a child who has not yet decided about this particular addition to his environment. Cassian had put his hands in his pockets and looked at his wife and his son in the salt air light of a coastal afternoon. And Elena had said, "Stay for dinner." He'd stayed. He'd stayed for dinner, and then helped with the bath, which was a production involving specific quantities of warm water, and a rubber duck of Luca's fierce attachment, and a towel with a small hood that Luca tolerated with an expression of resigned dignity. And by the time Luca was asleep in the new cradle, the evening had gone dark outside the window, and the sound of the water was audible from the shore below. Elena was washing dishes at the small sink, her back to him, and Cassian was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him. And the room was quiet in the specific way of rooms where two people are comfortable with the silence between them, which is a thing that takes time and cannot be performed, only arrived at. "There's a house," Elena said, not turning from the sink. 2 streets over, 3 bedrooms. It's been sitting empty since the spring. Cassian looked at her back. "I drove past it last week," she said. "The yard needs work." She paused. "I thought you should know it was available." He looked at his cold coffee. "Does it have a garage?" he said. "I don't know." "I'd need a garage," she said, "for the tools." A small pause, then the sound of the water turning off. And Elena turned around and leaned against the counter and looked at him across the small kitchen, with an expression that was not a smile and was not the removal of distance and was not anything he could have named in legal or tactical language, but that he understood completely with the part of him that had nothing to do with any of that. "Go look at it," she said. "Tomorrow." "I'll go tomorrow," he said. Outside, the water kept doing what water does, moving in the dark against the shore with the indifferent persistence of things that have been going on far longer than any of the people who live near them, taking no position on the human dramas that unfold in their vicinity and requiring nothing except to continue. Which is, when you have arrived at a certain place in a life, not such a bad model for how to proceed. Cassian picked up his coffee cup, found it cold, set it back down. He stayed at the table. Luca breathed in the other room. The water moved. The room was quiet. It was, all things considered, enough.